I'm on this panel because I have a degree in theology, the study of God, but it doesn't make me good at it. For work, I lead IT for a corporation.
I'm Lee Seitzma, and I also have a degree in theology. I taught at Marquette for 5 years with Mark here, and now I teach right across the parking lot at BCS.
Mark Chapman, and yes, I have a degree in theology. Lee and I went through the PhD program at Marquette together, and I miss his company. I teach at Marquette full-time.
Okay, so that's what they do. So they know a thing or two about grace. Let me start with you, Mark. In your work, so you teach at Marquette, how relevant is the theology of grace or the doctrines of grace in what you do, and why does that matter? Can you say a little more?
Well, I think my central task when I teach my intro to theology class is to try to get people to understand grace. I don't talk about Calvinism, to be honest. We're way below Calvinism when you're talking about freshmen in college. Mostly, I just long for them to abandon salvation by works, because in one way or another, almost all of them, in some way, think, well, I have to earn my salvation somehow, and if I'm a good enough person, God's going to be good to me. And the idea that you're saved by grace, I pound on it the whole semester, and still at the end of the semester I'll have some kids that you just see them kind of revert in how they understand things, which is kind of sad. But so the more I can get people to understand grace and the graciousness of God, it's a wonderful thing when people do understand it, and I do see kids change, and that's really fun. So.
All right, I'm going to ask you the same question, Lee. But before I ask, or before you can start speaking about or answering the question, I just want to share. This didn't happen here in Milwaukee, but when I was in Maryland, I was doing youth ministry, and one of the middle school students said, we were talking about grace, and one of the middle school students that I was working with, she said, "Grace is my friend's name." So I think it's important, what you do at BCS, I think it's important. So, hey, just tell us a little more about the relevance of the doctrine of grace today.
I'm going to start by my experience at Marquette, because it follows one Mark experienced very closely. I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students. I'd say 90 to 95% of them identified as Christians. I would ask, first day of class, they'd write me a little paper, what do you believe and why? And although 95% of my students called themselves Christians, almost 100% of them had never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so like Mark, I would pound that message over and over, that you are not saved. You are not going to heaven by being a good person. And they were shocked. And very interesting to me, one of the most frequent emotions or responses that I received from my students was anger. They could feel how life-changing the message was, that faith alone is what will save them. And they came up to me in droves, not angry at me, but why have we never been told about this ever? I've gone to church every Sunday for 18, 19, 20 years. I have never once even heard this. So grace remains absolutely 100% important and relevant. BCS students in many ways have advantages over my Marquette students, largely because of the community and parents like you here. Although it's a little surprising to me how many BCS students in middle school were hearing about grace for the first time. They could all say the words, Jesus died for my sins, and yet my students are amazed when I say that you are innocent in God's eyes now. And a lot of them are going through what I used to go through. I'm sorry, I'm talking a long time. I remember one of the things that got me interested in this topic is when I was their age, I began to get afraid. I used to think of grace as almost a magic formula. I have to say the right words to be forgiven. And I got to the point in my middle school life where every 10 or 15 seconds I would pause and say, please forgive me for whatever I did in the last 10 seconds. I was terrified. I did not understand grace and how amazing it is. And a lot of my BCS students, that's where they're at. And it's very eye-opening to them when they hear how amazing grace is.
Hey, Rick, you used to pastor a church. Now you are in the labor environment, and you are working with believers and non-believers. Hey, just tell us a little bit about how your understanding of grace prompts you to interact with other people in a way that kind of points to Jesus Christ.
I'll give you a story to talk about that. So when I went back into IT, because I had majored in computer science and business in college, and then worked as a software developer for 5 years, and then went to seminary and worked as a software developer all through seminary. So when I left the pastor, and that's another story. It was partly what happened with Steve dying in the church, and some struggles I had, and we were having. Barb's father passed away, and so forth. But so I went back into IT, and the Lord has been so good to me through that. And within 2 years, I went from being like a business analyst to being the chief information officer of one of GE's businesses, a reinsurance business. It was just a God thing. And what happened was the executive in charge of the whole thing just liked me. He was a Jewish guy, and he knew I was a former pastor, and he just liked me to the point where he tried to get us to move to Kansas City, and we said no. I'm like, I just moved my family. I'm not moving them again. He's driving me around in his Porsche in Kansas City. I'll put you in charge of the whole thing here. And we said no, but he respected that. But here's my point. So one day, a woman who worked for him, her husband died suddenly, or actually was diagnosed with cancer suddenly. He calls me up and he says, Rick, Leanne's husband's been diagnosed with cancer. This is a Jewish guy, very, very secular. And he says, and they need someone to pray with them, and we need someone to pray with them, and we're here in the hospital room. Would you come and pray with all of us? And I'm like, absolutely. I showed up there, we prayed, and that's just, I could give a lot of examples like that of the opportunity that God has given me to demonstrate His grace in the marketplace.
Yeah, before we open up to the audience here and take their questions, hey, is there anything that you would like to say before we open up? And as we continue in our study of the doctrines of grace, right? And we're going to take a few weeks talking about different points of Calvinism and stuff like that. Before we dive into that discussion, is there something that you want to say to frame the conversation that we're going to have in the coming weeks?
Well, you know, when I deal with my students, and when I learn about these kids, I learn about their background, I learn about what they think, I learn how they think. I feel very much in touch with where our culture's at today because I deal with 18-year-olds all the time, and even see how things have moved over the years. But it occurs to me that grace isn't just a problem for them. Grace is a problem for the church because we, on the whole, don't fully embrace grace as churches. And one of the reasons why a lot of these kids run the other way when they hear about Christianity is because of their experience in the church, frankly. Their picture of Christianity comes from the encounters they have with Christians and with church leadership and with what the church does. And there's so many churches that don't understand grace. What I constantly talk to them throughout the semester about grace, and one of the things I talk about is there's no such thing as a prideful Christian. But of course there is, right? There's all kinds of Christians who are prideful, who kind of, I've got Christianity, I've got my faith, and they kind of look down at the sinners around them as, Phariseeism is real and thrives today. And if we don't really deeply, deeply understand that we are saved by grace and nothing but grace, and that we approach others with a deep humility, knowing that we are every bit as fallen as anybody else, then, the message of Christianity doesn't have the power it should. And so understanding on a very deep, emotional, intellectual level that we are truly saved by grace changes how we think about God. It changes how we deal with other people. It eliminates our pride and lets us reach to people with love. So I think grace is absolutely essential.
Yeah, Lee, you can answer that question, but before you have the opportunity, hey, can I ask you to define grace for us? Because I think there's a lot of confusion about that terminology.
Yeah, there's books, the definition of grace. And just say God's unmerited favor. God's unmerited favor. Though, just not to put anyone on the spot, can you raise your hand if you've read the Canons of Dort? Okay. Some. Grace can be talked about in a very dry, difficult way. I'm sure Rick and Young Kwong are going to do a great job with their presentations. But there's a way in which, if you introduce Calvinism or Reformed theology by going through the mnemonic Tulip, which I have some issues with, I think Tulip can obscure grace just as much as it can highlight it. But I encourage you to read the Canons of Dort if you haven't. It's not a long document. It's very pastoral. It's very pastoral. It's very positive, talking about not just what we don't believe, but the positive, wonderful, amazing things we believe and why. So if you're interested in some of these topics, you can find it online. Meg, would you hold that up? I think we have this in the church library here, a little book that has all of our catechisms and creeds. But I learned about Tulip way before I read the canons. And when I read the Canons of Dort, it was like, wow, this is so much better. We should start here, right?
Anything to add, Rick?
Yeah, I think Tulip is pretty narrow. Reformed theology is so much broader and wider. And so when I think about Reformed theology, Tulip is really just about salvation and sustaining grace, persevering and so forth. But if you think more broadly about Reformed theology, it starts with creation, then redemption, and ultimately restoration, new creation. And so Reformed theology is so much bigger, and we really wanted to do a study on all of that, but you got to pick somewhere to start. So eventually we'll try and do some more studies like this through some other pieces of it. But you think about, I talked about people created in the image of God, right? That's an important part of Reformed theology that is something you have to balance total depravity with, right? Because, we don't teach people are just, as bad as they could be. And then there's other things in Reformed theology, like the whole idea of every square inch of this creation belongs to God, right? There's so much richness in the Reformed tradition that Tulip and that doesn't get at.
Well, thank you guys. Do you guys have any questions for these gentlemen up here? Yeah.
I have a question about unconditional election, which I know is supposed to be a doctrine of comfort, but I don't find it that way. It seems to me it is almost more unfathomable election than unconditional election, because we don't understand the conditions, but obviously God had a plan.
Good luck.
Repeat the question. Repeat the question when you answer it. When you answer it.
So your question was, why do we call it unconditional election when we don't even understand the process of how God elects his people?
Yes, and how can it be of comfort to us if we don't even know, if we don't know how and why, then how can we know that we're
Yeah, once again, I'm just going to backstep away, and good luck.
We're going to let one of the theologians take that.
This is one of the reasons why I found the canons of Dort so eye-opening, and it has a really long, helpful section about assurance. And this is one of the things that drove me into studying about this topic. My dissertation was broadly about this topic too, and ever since I was little, you would say, I would call it selfishness and self-interest, right? How do I know that I'm one of the elect? That bothered me as a kid. So first of all, I'd recommend the Canons of Dort. They'll do a lot better than I do. What unconditional election means is that there is not something in me that is better or that I can boast about compared to someone who says no to the gospel. So the Canons of Dort is arguing against a group of people that say, at the end of the day, if you have two identical people and the gospel was preached to both, and person A says, yes, Jesus, person B says, no, Jesus, what is it about person A that is better than person B? And there's two ways to go with this, and this is the Christian divide. Many Christians will say, there is something better about person A. Not much, it's still undeserved, but at the end of the day, there's some insight or some small clarity of thought or some extra humility or some extra intelligence that allows person A to say yes. And they have that, and person B does not. And so at the end of the day, they can take credit for just ever so little. And the Reformed faith says no. Unconditional election is that God chose his elect from before the foundation of the world, and we don't know why. All we know is it's not because person A is better morally or through their intellect more than person B. Now, to get from there to your question, how in the world does that bring you assurance? That's a longer answer, but read the Canons of Dort. Maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, we can. The only thing I would add is there's a lot of scripture that teaches that we can be assured of our salvation. So the question is not, am I one of the elect? The question is, do I have faith in Jesus Christ alone for my salvation? That's the question. If you do, then you're one of the elect. I mean, that's how I would view that.
And the comfort comes because, as Lee said, there's nothing about us. It's not about you. It's not about something you did, something you have, some quality. And God said, hey, thumbs up on him. He's better than the other guy. It's all about God's chosenness. And so that's the comfort, is that I can't screw it up because God has his hand on me. And he'll never let you go. And thick or thin, he'll never let you go. He won't ever drop you. And it doesn't depend on me. And so that's the deep comfort that's meant to come out of this doctrine. And Luther talked about that a lot too. We can jump over to Lutheran circles. They're all part of the Reformed, broadly speaking, position. But that's meant to be a deep comfort. I mean, that's what's troubling about some other theological positions that talk about, well, God can change his mind, or God can, you can fall away and lose your salvation somehow. Because Reformed thought says, we're dead in sin, right? We're dead. I mean, that's the picture. You're dead in your sin. There's nothing you can, dead people don't raise themselves, all right? Only God can raise you. And if God raises you, you are alive again. And you're not going to die again, ever. So,
I think we have time for one quick question. One more quick question. Anyone? Yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit about total depravity? This idea that I think some get about Reformed theology is that we're all groveling on the ground in sin. There's nothing at all good about us. When the argument is then, there's people who aren't Christians, they do good things in the world. How can that be? How can there be total depravity and goodness in us both at the same time?
I think total depravity is a very misunderstood doctrine. A lot of people, when they hear total depravity, they think what Reformed thought teaches is that we are all completely and fully sinful in every way. You know, that's Reformed theology, right? Total depravity says there's no part of us that is not touched by sin. There's no part of us that's not corrupted by sin. It's not like we have a sinful body or a sinful flesh or sinful sexual desires, but our intellect is undisturbed. I mean, even the way that we think is disturbed, is undermined by sin. It doesn't mean we are completely and fully evil in every way. There's goodness. We were made, you know, one beautiful thing about the Scripture, you know, the creation story, it was good, it was good, it was good. God creates humanity, it was very good. That was the peak, right? That's the best day of the creation. God created a good creation. He created us in His image. We all have intrinsic value and goodness and worth. But there's the fall. And so we all are distorted in various ways, which is why we have to look to Scripture, not to ourselves.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll continue our conversation next week, so please come back next week.
Thanks.